November 1944, the Hürtgen forest. It was not a forest in the idyllic sense, but a splintered, sodden hell of shattered tree trunks and churned mud. The air, thick with the smell of wet pine and cordite, was a constant, low hum of distant artillery. For the men of the 275th Infantry Division, hunkered down in waterlogged foxholes, the world had shrunk to this perpetual twilight under the dense canopy. They were ghosts haunting their own graves, their Feldgrau uniforms stained black with mud and rain, their faces gaunt and sallow. Hunger was not an occasional visitor. It was a permanent resident, a hollow ache in the pit of the stomach that gnawed away at courage, at discipline, at hope itself. They were trapped in a meat grinder, fighting for a cause that felt as distant and abstract as the Sunday. It was in this state of profound physical and spiritual exhaustion that the end came, not with a heroic last stand, but with the clank of Sherman tank treads and the terrifyingly casual chatter of American voices. For the survivors, capture was less a defeat and more a simple cessation of misery. Yet the true shock, the moment of irreversible psychological collapse, would not come from an interrogation or the sight of enemy firepower. This war, for them, would be understood and its outcome accepted not on the battlefield, but in a prisoner processing line, with the taste of a simple, industrially perfect loaf of American bread. This is the story of how the Allied logistical machine, a force more powerful than any panzer division, waged a silent and decisive war against the morale of the German soldier, proving that an army's spirit does not march on ideology alone, but on calories, and that the chasm between Germany's Ersatz reality and America's staggering abundance was wide enough to swallow the entire Third Reich. The reality of the German Lanzer's diet was a story of constant decline, a slow descent into organized malnutrition masked by the stoic acceptance of military duty. Günther K. Koschorek, whose searing memoir Blood Red Snow chronicled his experience as a machine gunner, provides an unflinching look at the foundation of this diet. While his service was primarily on the Eastern Front, the logistical realities he describes were endemic to the entire German war machine by 1944. The staple of the German ration was the Kommissbrot, a dense, dark rye bread that was, in the early years, a source of sustenance and national pride. But as the war bled Germany's resources dry, the quality plummeted. Koschorek and his comrades spoke of bread that was more sawdust than rye, bulked out with straw, beet pulp, and other fillers to maintain the illusion of a full ration. He wrote of the constant, obsessive daydreams of food, of the simple pleasure of a piece of bacon or real butter, luxuries that had long vanished. Our hunger became a faithful companion, he recalled in post-war interviews, describing a state where the procurement of a few potatoes from a frozen field was a tactical victory more celebrated than any medal. This was not just a failure of supply, it was a visible, edible manifestation of a failing state. The bread, the very staff of life, was becoming a fraud. Every gritty, unsatisfying mouthful was a reminder that the Reich, for all its propaganda of strength and superiority, could no longer even feed its own soldiers properly. This degradation of the most basic element of survival created a deep, unspoken fragility in the German fighting man's psyche. On the other side of the battle lines, a completely different reality existed, one driven by a philosophy of overwhelming material advantage. The American Quartermaster Corps operated on a scale that was simply incomprehensible to their German counterparts. While the German soldier subsisted on a crumbling logistical chain, the American GI was the endpoint of a vast, uninterrupted conveyor belt of supply stretching back to the factories and farms of a continent untouched by war. Memoirs from American quartermaster officers of the European theatre of operations speak of a system designed to deliver not just sustenance, but morale. The famous K ration, a waxed cardboard box containing 3 meals, was a marvel of industrial food science. It contained canned meat or cheese, biscuits, a fruit bar, soluble coffee, sugar, and, famously, 4 cigarettes. It was a complete package of calories and comfort. For the German prisoners, often starved for days and subsisting on watery soup or ersatz bread. The first encounter with these rations was a profound shock. The American quartermasters followed standard procedure. Newly captured prisoners were to be fed, and they were fed the same rations as the men who had just captured them. There was no special, inferior POW food initially. They received the same industrially packaged, calorie-dense meals. The casual abundance was baffling. American soldiers might complain about the monotony of the K rations, but to a man who had been eating sawdust bread, it was a feast. The sight of pallets upon pallets of these boxes, stacked high at supply dumps just miles behind the front, was more devastating to morale than a carpet-bombing raid. It was a quiet, crushing testament to an enemy that could afford to mass-produce and distribute such quality on a scale that Germany could no longer even imagine. This symbolic difference was backed by the cold, hard numbers of logistics. In 1944, the official German Wehrmacht ration scale, or Ersatz I, for a frontline soldier theoretically allotted around 3,600 calories per day. However, this was an ideal, rarely, if ever, met. The catastrophic losses of equipment and infrastructure following the Normandy landings and the subsequent retreat across France had shattered the German supply network. Allied air power relentlessly savaged rail lines and truck convoys. Fuel was so scarce that horse-drawn carts became a common sight in the logistical trains of even vaunted panzer divisions. As a result, the actual caloric intake of a German soldier on the Western Front often fell below 2,000 calories, a diet of slow starvation. In stark contrast, the American system, while not perfect, was robust and consistent. A full day's worth of K rations delivered approximately 2,830 calories, but this was merely the baseline. Whenever possible, units were supplied with B rations, canned, preserved foods for field kitchens, or A rations, fresh food. The standard C ration, consisting of canned entrees, delivered over 3,700 calories. The logistical might of the United States ensured that this caloric advantage was maintained with relentless consistency. For every German truck destroyed, 10 more American trucks seemed to appear, laden with fuel, ammunition, and food. This statistical dominance, this industrial hammer, meant that the American soldier was better fed, healthier, and more capable of sustained combat. The German POW, upon tasting his first American meal, was not just eating food, he was consuming the undeniable proof of this logistical chasm. The introduction to the world of American abundance was therefore a moment of profound psychological recalibration. It was the beginning of an unraveling, where the grand narratives of German superiority and heroic struggle collapsed in the face of simple, irrefutable evidence. The exhausted, half-starved German soldier, standing in the mud of the Hürtgen represented the end result of a system stretched beyond its breaking point. His imminent capture and first meal as a prisoner would force him to confront the truth, not through a commissar's speech or a general's order, but through his own senses. Before he would taste the white bread, he first had to understand the gritty reality of the black bread he was leaving behind forever. This foundation of the Wehrmacht diet, the Schwarzbrot, was more than just a ration. It was a symbol of the very nature of the German war effort itself. To understand the psychological impact of American white bread, one must first understand the deep, almost spiritual significance of German black bread. In the German psyche, bread, specifically dark, dense, whole-grain rye bread, or Schwarzbrot, was never just food. It was Heimat, the homeland itself, a tangible piece of German soil and soul. It represented strength, endurance, and a connection to an agrarian past. The phrase Brot und Stahl, bread and steel, was not mere rhetoric, it was a foundational concept of national identity, linking the farmer's rye field to the Krupp steelworks, the soldier's ration to his rifle. This was the bread of poets and soldiers, a food that supposedly built the strong backs and unwavering will of the German people. Before the war, a loaf of Schwarzbrot was a point of pride. Its complex, slightly sour taste and hearty texture, a rejection of the perceived softness and decadence of foreign white breads. It was this powerful cultural symbol that the Nazi regime inherited and weaponized, promising to protect the German breadbasket and the purity of its daily loaf. But like so many of its promises, the reality of the Third Reich's bread would become a bitter, gritty betrayal of the ideal it claimed to champion. The war would systematically strip the German loaf of its integrity, replacing wholesome rye with industrial waste, turning a symbol of strength into an edible emblem of decay. The decline began almost immediately, a quiet and insidious process hidden beneath the noise of early victories. Germany had entered the war in 1939 with a food situation that was precarious at best, and the regime, acutely aware of how the turnip winter of 1916 had broken civilian morale in the First World War, implemented a comprehensive rationing system from day one. Initially, the military bread, the Kommissbrot, was of a reasonably high standard, a durable rye loaf designed for the rigours of the field. But the demands of a total war economy quickly began to eat away at its quality. Diaries from the German home front during the 1939 to 1942 period are filled with the first mentions of change. Housewives noted the new texture of their rationed bread, the subtle shift in taste as government mandates forced bakeries to incorporate extenders. The first official adulterant was potato flour, a measure to conserve precious rye. Then came increased percentages of barley, oats, and bran. Official records from the Reich Ministry of Food and Agriculture detail these early decrees with bureaucratic detachment, presenting them as necessary measures for the war effort. But for the average German, and the soldier on the front, it was the first sign that the promised abundance of the new order was a fiction. The bread was becoming less satisfying, less nourishing. The hearty loaf that was supposed to fuel the conquest of Europe was already being diluted, its very essence compromised by the state it was meant to sustain. The true collapse, however, came after the catastrophic turning point of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942–43. From this point forward, the German war machine was in a constant state of logistical retreat, and the quality of the soldiers' bread plummeted into the abyss. The Eastern Front, in particular, became a laboratory for ersatz engineering. The memoirs of soldiers who survived that inferno speak of bread that was barely recognizable as food. Guy Sager, in his harrowing account The Forgotten Soldier, describes the rations with visceral detail. He and his comrades were issued loaves that were heavy, damp, and smelled faintly of mold and chemicals. He writes of bread that was notoriously difficult to digest, leading to chronic stomach ailments. The reason was the escalating use of fillers that had no nutritional value whatsoever. To maintain the size and weight of a standard loaf, thereby keeping up the pretense of a full ration, army bakeries were ordered to mix in appalling ingredients. Chief among them was sawdust, or sägemehl, swept from the floors of lumber mills. To this was added straw, ground into a coarse flour, and the fibrous pulp left over from sugar beet processing. Wilhelm Prüller, a Nazi Party stalwart whose diary provides a candid look at the Wehrmacht experience, noted with growing concern the state of his rations, complaining that the bread often tasted like wood. This was not food, it was a mockery of it. It was a kilogram of deception that filled a soldier's stomach with indigestible bulk, cheating him of the energy he desperately needed to fight and survive. This descent into inedibility was the direct result of a strategic and industrial catastrophe. The industrial hammer of the Allies was striking Germany not just in its factories, but in its fields. The primary cause was the loss of territory. The fertile plains of Ukraine, which had been heralded by Hitler as the breadbasket that would feed the Reich for 1,000 years, were largely retaken by the Red Army throughout 1943 and 1944. This single blow deprived Germany of millions of tons of grain. Simultaneously, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was strangling the inputs of German agriculture. The same chemical plants, like the Luna works, that produced synthetic fuel and explosives also manufactured nitrogen-based fertilizers. As these plants were systematically pulverized from the air, fertilizer production collapsed. German farm yields, already strained by a lack of manpower and machinery, began to fall sharply. The Reich Food Administration, under the control of Herbert Bacher, responded not by admitting the crisis, but by institutionalizing the fraud. A series of decrees mandated specific, increasing percentages of Ersatz fillers in all bread produced for military and civilian consumption. By 1944, it was officially sanctioned policy to feed the German people and its army a concoction of rye, potato, and industrial waste. The state was knowingly poisoning its own people to prolong the war, a fact that could be tasted in every single meal. Thus, the German soldiers' daily bread became a perfect metaphor for the hollowing out of the Third Reich itself. On the outside, it retained the form and name of a loaf, just as the regime maintained the facade of an invincible state. But inside it was rotten, its substance replaced by worthless filler, its nourishment a lie. This was not a sudden shock, but a slow, grinding realization that occurred over months and years, in every field kitchen and every foxhole. The daily act of eating became a reminder of weakness, of the failure of the system. This prolonged experience of consuming ersatz reality created a deep-seated psychological vulnerability. The German soldier was not just physically hungry, he was starved for authenticity, for something real. He had been conditioned by his own rations to understand the vast difference between a promise and its fulfillment. This conditioning would prove to be the perfect setup for the moment of capture, when he would be handed a piece of food that was utterly, shockingly, and undeniably real. The end did not arrive with a predictable cinematic climax. It came in a cacophony of overwhelming, impersonal violence. For a Lanza huddled in a collapsed cellar in the ruins of Aachen or a foxhole in the Ardennes, the final moments of his war were a sensory assault. It was the terrifying, rhythmic roar of American artillery, a sound the Germans called the steel storm, that seemed to tear the very air apart. It was the relentless chatter of Browning machine guns, a volume of fire that made a single MG-42 sound like a child's toy. Then came the tanks, Shermans in seemingly endless columns, not picking their way carefully but rolling over trenches and through walls with an arrogant, unstoppable momentum. And then, as suddenly as it began, a deafening silence. This silence was more unnerving than the noise. Into this void stepped the American GIs. They were not the goose-stepping supermen of propaganda. They were young, often weary, but they moved with a casual confidence that was utterly demoralizing. They were tall, well-fed, their uniforms clean and functional. They carried an abundance of everything: ammunition, grenades, cigarettes. For the German soldier, rising slowly from his hole with hands raised high, this was the first intimate contact with the enemy. It was a moment of profound internal conflict, a nauseating cocktail of shame at the surrender, tempered by an overwhelming primal sense of relief that the dying was finally over. Benno Ziese, a young German soldier captured during the final months of the war, chronicled this disorienting transition with poignant clarity in his memoir, In Their Shallow Graves. His account strips away any notion of martial glory, revealing the raw human experience of becoming a prisoner. Ziese describes the initial moments as a state of dreamlike unreality. "The fighting was over for us," he wrote. "We had no more responsibility. It was a state of complete indifference. This emotional numbness was quickly followed by the physical reality of capture. The search for weapons was methodical and impersonal. American soldiers, often chewing gum, would roughly pat them down, taking pistols, knives, and any souvenirs. Ziese watched as his comrades were stripped of their watches and personal photographs, the small totems of their former lives. What struck him most was the demeanor of his captors. There was no fury, no lust for revenge that he had been taught to expect. Instead, there was a kind of detached, business-like efficiency. He observed their equipment with a soldier's eye: the sturdy boots, the warm-looking field jackets, the sheer quantity of gear each man carried. "We were all so filthy and ragged," he remembered, "and they looked as if they had just stepped out of a barracks. This first impression was not of a brutal enemy, but of a profoundly, inexplicably wealthy one. The war was already being reframed in his mind, not as a clash of ideologies, but as a contest between a nation of scarcity and a nation of impossible plenty. From the American perspective, the men they were capturing in the autumn and winter of 1944 were a shocking sight. The historian S.L.A. Marshall, who conducted extensive after-action interviews with U.S. troops, recorded their impressions. The GIs consistently noted the poor physical condition of their prisoners. They were expecting to fight the hardened professional soldiers of the early war blitzkriegs. Instead, they were rounding up a Volkssturm army, a collection of the very young and the very old. They saw boys of 16 with fear in their eyes and men in their 50s with the grey, weary faces of grandfathers. Their uniforms were a patchwork of worn-out feldgrau, often supplemented with ill-fitting civilian clothing. Their boots were falling apart, the leather cracked and rotten from months spent in wet foxholes. Most alarming was their evident state of malnutrition. The prisoners were gaunt, with sunken cheeks and the hollow-eyed stare of men who had been slowly starving for weeks. American soldiers would often, against regulations, share their own rations with the newly captured men, moved to pity by their desperate hunger. This was a powerful psychological moment for the victors as well as the vanquished. It was impossible to look upon these ragged, hungry figures and still see the master race of Goebbels' propaganda films. The enemy, when seen up close, was not a monster. He was a starving, exhausted boy, and the act of giving him a chocolate bar was an implicit acknowledgement that the war was already won. This flood of half-starved, demoralized prisoners was not an anomaly. It was a defining feature of the war on the Western Front. The industrial hammer of the Allied armies was designed to create not just battlefield victories, but systemic collapses. The encirclement of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 was a prime example. In the space of a week, the Allies captured around 50,000 German soldiers. This was not a battle. It was an industrial-scale harvesting of an army. The roads were choked with columns of defeated men, a river of grey uniforms flowing into Allied captivity. Between D-Day in June 1944 and the start of the Battle of the Bulge in December, the Western Allies took over 1 million German prisoners. This number was so immense that it created a logistical crisis of its own. Processing, feeding and housing this mountain of men became a major operational concern for SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Enormous temporary enclosures, vast fields surrounded by barbed wire, were hastily constructed in France and Belgium. These camps, known as cages, became the first stop for the captured Lanzer. The scale of the defeat was undeniable, written in the sheer statistics of captivity. For the individual German soldier, his personal surrender was multiplied by tens of thousands, transforming him from a warrior into a data point in the calculus of total war. The journey from the front line to the barbed wire was therefore a fundamental transformation. It was a passage from a world of brutal, immediate violence into a world of impersonal, bureaucratic systems. The soldier ceased to be a name and became a number, tagged and processed, his fate now in the hands of his enemies. He had left behind the familiar misery of the trenches, the gnawing hunger for ersatz bread, and the constant fear of death. He was now entering a new, unknown reality, one that he had been conditioned to believe was barbaric and cruel. But it was in this sterile, controlled environment of the POW processing line that the most potent weapon of the Allied arsenal would be deployed. It was here that the war of ideas, of propaganda, of national will, would be rendered utterly meaningless. The next stage of his journey would introduce him to the true nature of his enemy, not through an interrogation, but through the simple, devastating act of being fed. The shock was being prepared. The journey into captivity began with a long, shuffling march. For the newly captured German soldiers, this was a trek through a landscape of contradictions. They were leaving behind the hell of the front line, but marching towards an unknown, propagandized terror. Goebbels films and the weekly newsreels had painted a vivid picture of the Americans, a mongrel race of gangsters and cowboys who were both decadent and unspeakably cruel. They were told to expect summary executions, brutal beatings, and, at best, a deliberate policy of starvation. This narrative was reinforced by their own army's conduct, particularly on the Eastern Front, where the concept of humane treatment for prisoners was a fantasy. The German Lanzer, therefore, trudged along the muddy roads of France expecting the worst. Every distant shout from a guard, every jeep that roared past their column, was a potential prelude to violence. They were mentally steeled for a battle of survival against their captors, a continuation of the war by other means. The reality they were about to encounter would be far more psychologically disarming than the simple cruelty they anticipated. Their first stop was a transit camp, a vast, hastily erected city of tents and barbed wire. Here, the first stage of their new lives as prisoners of war began, and it was nothing like they had imagined. There were no political commissars screaming ideology, no guards looking for an excuse to inflict pain. Instead, they were met with a process of industrial-scale hygiene that was both baffling and profoundly shocking. In his definitive study, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, historian Arnold Kramer collected numerous accounts of this first contact. The Germans were stripped of their filthy, lice-infested uniforms and herded into lines. They were then subjected to a powerful, billowing cloud of white powder, blasted from mechanical sprayers wielded by impassive American personnel wearing masks. This was DDT. For the German soldier, who associated chemical sprays with the horrors of gas warfare, this was a moment of terror. But the terror quickly gave way to confusion. This wasn't a weapon to kill them, but a chemical to clean them. The Americans were systematically delousing them, thousands upon thousands, with the same impersonal efficiency one would use to disinfect cattle or equipment. It was a stunning display of power. The Wehrmacht, at this stage of the war, could barely find enough gasoline to move its tanks, yet the Americans had developed and deployed a chemical industry capable of delousing an entire captured army as a matter of standard procedure. This procedure, from the American point of view, had nothing to do with psychology and everything to do with administration. The official histories of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps reveal an organization grappling with a colossal management problem. The flood of prisoners in late 1944 threatened to overwhelm their resources and posed a significant public health risk, particularly the spread of typhus, which is carried by lice. The response was not emotional, it was systematic. Standard operating procedures were drafted and distributed for the in-processing of enemy personnel. The German POW was a unit to be processed, an entry on a ledger. He had to be disarmed, searched, deloused, documented, fed, and housed. Each step was broken down into a series of repeatable actions, an assembly line for human beings. The quartermaster staff in the European theatre of operations were not warriors. They were logisticians, warehouse managers, and administrators. They viewed the columns of German prisoners with the same unemotional eye they might use for a convoy of trucks or a shipment of ammunition. This cold, bureaucratic approach was, in its own way, more demoralizing than hatred. The German soldiers had been raised in a cult of warrior identity, to be treated not as a respected, defeated foe, but as a large-scale sanitation problem, was a deep and subtle humiliation. The industrial and statistical hammer behind this process was immense. To even begin to comprehend the American logistical mindset, one need only look at the resources required to create a single temporary transit camp for 50,000 prisoners. Such a camp required hundreds of tons of barbed wire, not spooled out in a single defensive line, but woven into complex networks of fences and enclosures. It required thousands of 16-man squad tents, a city of canvas rising from the mud in a matter of days. Sanitation required engineering on a massive scale, digging vast latrine trenches and providing tens of thousands of gallons of chlorinated water for drinking and washing every single day. Most critically, the Quartermaster Corps operated on the principle of proactive supply. Before the first column of prisoners arrived, the food dumps for the camp were already being established. This meant requisitions for tons of flour, tons of canned meat, tons of coffee and sugar. Based on standard POW ration allowances, feeding 50,000 men required a delivery of at least 50 to 60 tons of food every single day. The logistical chain to ensure this, the trucks, the drivers, the fuel, the warehouses, the port facilities, was staggering. The Wehrmacht's logistics in 1944 were a desperate hand-to-mouth affair, struggling to get a few truckloads of sawdust bread and horsemeat to the front. The American system was planning and delivering provisions for a captive army larger than the entire force the Germans had used to conquer Norway. Therefore, the German POW's first contact with the American war machine was a lesson in industrial power, not military brutality. He was stripped, sprayed, and sorted not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated American belief in efficiency and systems management. He was witnessing a form of warfare that was entirely alien to him. He had been trained to think of war in terms of courage, sacrifice, and tactical brilliance. He was now a cog in a machine that ran on purchase orders, shipping manifests, and statistical projections. This impersonal, overwhelming competence was more terrifying than a tiger tank because it could not be fought. It was a force of nature, a new kind of gravity that was pulling his world apart. This system, which had so efficiently processed his body, was now about to deliver its most potent and memorable product. The stage was set for the true moment of surrender, a surrender that would take place not when he dropped his rifle, but when he was handed his first meal. After the impersonal efficiency of delousing and processing, the German prisoners were herded into muddy enclosures to await their first meal. Shuffling forward in a long, weary line, their expectations were shaped by years of their own army's field kitchens. They anticipated at best a ladle of thin, watery turnip soup. At worst, they expected to be given a piece of their own despised Kommissbrot, a final, cynical humiliation. The air was cold and damp, smelling of mud and the collective exhaustion of thousands of defeated men. An American cook, a burly figure in a white apron that seemed impossibly clean, stood behind a row of large, steaming cauldrons. As the first German soldier reached the front of the line, holding out his tin mess kit, he braced himself for the familiar slop. Instead, the cook wordlessly used a pair of tongs to place two thick, perfectly uniform slices of bread onto his tray. The soldier stopped. He stared. It was not grey. It was not brown. It was a brilliant, pure, shocking white. The sensory experience was a complete violation of their reality. Helmut Horner, a soldier captured in France, described the moment in his memoirs with a sense of wonder that bordered on the religious. He picked up the slice of bread, and the first thing he noticed was its weight, or rather, the lack of it. His own army's bread was a dense, heavy brick that had to be sawed apart. This American bread was as light and soft as a cloud. He brought it to his mouth and took a bite. The texture was astonishing. There was no grit, no hard kernel of rye, no fibrous hint of straw or sawdust. It dissolved on the tongue with a faint, sweet taste. To Horner and countless others, it was not bread at all. It was cake. The German word they consistently used to describe it in their letters and diaries was Kuchen. For a man whose palate had been conditioned by years of Ersatz food, this simple product of refined flour, yeast, sugar, and salt was the most decadent luxury he had ever tasted. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated pleasure that was immediately followed by a wave of profound confusion. This was the food of the gods, and it was being given to them, the defeated, with the same casual indifference as if it were water. This sensory shock quickly gave way to a devastating intellectual realization. As the German prisoners sat in the mud, silently chewing their cake, a terrible and unavoidable logic began to assert itself in their minds. The thought process, described in numerous post-war interviews, was almost universal. It began with a simple question. If this is what they feed their prisoners, what on earth do their own soldiers eat? The question was a crack in the foundation of their entire worldview. From there, the logic cascaded. If their soldiers ate this well, What must their civilians be eating back home? They thought of their own families, of the increasingly meagre rations in Germany, of the letters describing the endless search for a few extra potatoes. The comparison was unbearable. This single slice of white bread was an irrefutable testament to an agricultural and industrial base so powerful, so vast, that it could afford to waste such luxury on its enemies. The stories they had been told by their officers and by Goebbels' propaganda machine of a decadent, weak America on the verge of collapse were not just lies, they were absurdities. No nation on the verge of collapse could produce and distribute food like this. The war, they suddenly understood, had never been a fair fight. They had been struggling in a war of attrition against an enemy who simply could not be attrited. The industrial hammer that had forged this slice of bread was, in every sense, the true Allied superweapon. America's agricultural output during the war was staggering. While German farmers struggled with fertilizer shortages and a lack of manpower, the American heartland was producing record harvests. In 1944 alone, the United States harvested over 1.1 billion bushels of wheat from a landmass completely untouched by enemy bombs. This river of grain flowed into a network of highly mechanized industrial-scale bakeries, the standard U.S. Army Type B field bread was a product of intense scientific research by the Quartermaster Corps' Subsistence Research Laboratory. It was made from enriched white flour, with vitamins and minerals like niacin, iron, and thiamine added back in to ensure maximum nutritional value for the soldiers. The entire concept of enriching food was a level of sophistication that the German war economy, focused on Ersatz substitutes, could not even comprehend. The American logistical chain was capable of baking millions of loaves a day in rear-area field bakeries and delivering them fresh to the front. The German soldier was eating sawdust. The American soldier was eating scientifically enhanced, industrially produced white bread, and there was enough left over to feed the millions of prisoners they were taking. The white bread was therefore more than food. It was a silent, edible propaganda leaflet. It needed no text, no explanation. Its message was contained in its very substance. It communicated American power more effectively than a 1,000-bomber raid. A bomber raid could be survived. It could even reinforce a soldier's will to fight. But the bread could not be fought. It had to be ingested, absorbed, and its implications had to be confronted internally. It represented a victory not of arms, but of farms, factories, and a system of production that Germany could not hope to match. For countless German soldiers, the war was not lost when the last panzer ran out of fuel or the last bullet was fired. It was lost in a POW camp, with the soft, sweet taste of white bread in their mouths. It was the taste of a total, comprehensive, and undeniable defeat. The white bread was the initial salvo, a stunning and direct assault on the German soldiers' most basic assumptions. But it was only the opening act in a much broader offensive of consumer abundance. As the initial shock of the first meal subsided, and the days in the transit camps turned into weeks, the prisoners of war became unwilling observers of a culture that defied all their understanding. They watched their American guards, young men not so different from themselves, and saw that the logistical miracle was not confined to the mess tent. It was in their pockets, in their hands, in the very air they casually exhaled. The war of production was being fought not just with tanks and planes, but with pocket-sized, mass-produced symbols of a society so wealthy it could afford to provide its soldiers with an endless stream of non-essential comforts. Each of these small items was another nail in the coffin of Nazi ideology, another quiet confirmation that the Third Reich had picked a fight with a force it could never hope to comprehend. The first truly alien artifact they encountered was often Coca-Cola. For the German soldier, a sweet drink was a rare treat, usually a synthetic, saccharin-sweetened concoction with a faint chemical aftertaste, served on special occasions. In the POW camps, they watched as American guards would casually pop the cap off a uniquely contoured, dark glass bottle and drink a bubbling black liquid. The experience of tasting it for the first time, often when a guard would offer a bottle as a gesture of casual goodwill, was bizarre. In his studies on the POW experience, historian Matthias Rees notes that the Germans had no frame of reference for the flavor. It was intensely sweet, but with a complex, spicy, and acidic bite, and the carbonation was a strange sensation. But more shocking than the taste was the sheer ubiquity of the product. The Wehrmacht struggled to supply water. The Americans were supplying a branded soft drink. The very concept was insane. This was not a drink for quenching thirst or providing nutrition. It was a frivolous, unnecessary pleasure. And yet, the American military-industrial complex could produce it on a scale that allowed it to be distributed by the truckload to the front lines. It was a powerful symbol of an economy that operated on a different plane of reality, one where pleasure itself could be industrialized and weaponized as a tool of morale. Equally potent was the message sent by American cigarettes. The German soldiers' Stumpen were notoriously harsh, often little more than cabbage leaves or other dried vegetation, mixed with low-grade tobacco, rolled in coarse paper. They were precious, hoarded, and traded for favors. The American GI, by contrast, was a walking tobacco advertisement. Every K ration contained a small pack of 4 cigarettes, and cartons of brands like Chesterfield, Lucky Strike, and Camel were distributed through the PX system in staggering quantities. The German POWs watched in disbelief as their guards would smoke constantly, often lighting a new cigarette from the end of the old one, discarding half-smoked butts without a second thought. For a German who would save a butt to re-roll it later, this was an act of almost obscene wastefulness. The American cigarettes themselves were objects of wonder. They were perfectly uniform, white and smooth, with a rich, pleasant aroma that was a world away from the acrid smoke of their own. This was another quiet lesson in industrial disparity. It spoke of America's unhindered access to global raw materials, the rich tobacco fields of the Carolinas and Virginia, and a manufacturing base that could roll, package, and ship billions of units with effortless precision. This flood of morale goods was no accident. It was a calculated and essential component of the American war strategy. The industrial hammer of the United States was geared to produce not just weapons, but a comprehensive system for maintaining the well-being and fighting spirit of its troops. In 1943, General Dwight D. Prose, Eisenhower himself sent an urgent cable requesting the shipment of equipment and materials to establish 10 Coca-Cola bottling plants in North Africa. The Coca-Cola company was given a special designation as a technical supplier to the armed forces, and its employees followed the front lines, setting up bottling operations in captured cities. By the end of the war, 64 bottling plants had been shipped, and over 5 billion bottles of Coke had been consumed by American servicemen. The story of the tobacco industry was even more immense. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 300 billion cigarettes. A significant portion of this output was earmarked for the military. The US government considered cigarettes an essential wartime supply, on par with bullets and boots. This entire philosophy was alien to the Nazi concept of total war, which demanded total sacrifice from its soldiers and civilians. The American system, in contrast, was powerful enough to demand victory from its soldiers, while simultaneously providing them with the comforts of home. This constant daily exposure to American consumerism was a deeply subversive force. It worked on the German psyche in a way that no propaganda leaflet ever could. The white bread had shown them that America could feed them better than their own army. The Coca-Cola and cigarettes showed them that the average American soldier lived a life of casual luxury that was unimaginable even for a high-ranking officer in the Wehrmacht. It chipped away at the very core of their motivation. They had been told they were fighting a heroic struggle, sacrificing everything for the fatherland against a weak and decadent enemy. But the evidence of their own eyes told a different story. The enemy was not weak, it was infinitely strong, and its decadence was simply a baseline standard of living so high that it could be maintained even in the midst of a global war. The psychological surrender that began with a slice of bread was now being reinforced with every sip of soda and every puff of a cigarette. The American assembly line was not just outproducing German factories, it was systematically dismantling the German soldiers' will to fight. The accumulation of shocks, the delousing, the white bread, the Coca-Cola, the cigarettes had now reached a critical mass in the mind of the German prisoner of war. The experience had moved beyond simple sensory overload. It had triggered a profound and deeply personal intellectual crisis. The German Lanza, a man conditioned by 12 years of totalitarian indoctrination to think as part of a collective Volk, was now forced into a state of solitary contemplation. Sitting in the muddy confines of a POW camp, he began to deconstruct his own reality, to audit the foundational beliefs upon which his entire life as a soldier had been built. This was no longer about the taste of bread. It was about the taste of truth. The chasm between the world he had been promised and the world he was now witnessing was too vast to be ignored or explained away. The process of psychological surrender had begun, an internal collapse that was far more significant than the physical act of dropping his rifle. The historian Stephen G. Fritz, in his seminal work Endkampf, analyzed the letters of German soldiers during these final, agonizing months of the war. He uncovered a rising chorus of disillusionment and despair. The letters sent home from the front lines were a mirror image of the realizations occurring in the POW camps. Soldiers wrote of the material Schlacht, the battle of material, with a sense of awe and hopelessness. They described the endless columns of American trucks, the sky black with Allied aircraft, the sheer, inexhaustible volume of enemy artillery fire. This was juxtaposed with bitter complaints about their own situation, the lack of fuel, the inadequate rations, the worn-out equipment. The myth of the Endsieg, the final victory promised by the Führer, was evaporating in the face of this overwhelming material reality. A common theme was a feeling of profound betrayal and abandonment by their own leadership. They felt they had been lied to, sent on a fool's errand, and were now being asked to sacrifice their lives for a cause that was visibly, demonstrably lost. For the soldier in the field, this realization led to a grim, fatalistic resolve. For the soldier in the POW camp, free from the immediate threat of death and the pressure of his officers, that same realization led to a quiet, rational recalibration of his loyalties. This internal collapse was not just anecdotal, it was a phenomenon studied and weaponized by the Allies. The Psychological Warfare Division, PWD, of SHAEF, was an organization dedicated to understanding and breaking the morale of the German soldier. They systematically interrogated thousands of newly captured prisoners, not for tactical intelligence, but for psychological data. Their declassified reports from late 1944 are a clinical analysis of a dying army's spirit. The interrogators asked a simple question. Why did your will to fight collapse? The answers were compiled and ranked. While factors like Allied air supremacy and the sheer weight of artillery were significant, the PWD reports consistently highlighted one factor above many others: the overwhelming superiority of enemy equipment and supply. Prisoners spoke at length about the hopelessness of fighting an enemy who seemed to have an infinite supply of everything. They contrasted their own threadbare logistics with the sight of American supply dumps overflowing with food, fuel, and ammunition. The PWD concluded that German morale was not breaking because of a loss of ideological faith in National Socialism, but because of a rational, soldierly assessment of the logistical situation. The German Lanza was, first and foremost, a practical man. He could see with his own eyes that the war of production had been lost, and he saw no honor in dying for a foregone conclusion. The statistical evidence of this morale collapse is stark. The industrial hammer of Allied production was matched by an industrial-scale collapse in German cohesion. On the Western Front, desertion and surrender rates, which had been relatively low, began to skyrocket after the breakout from Normandy. Entire units would simply dissolve during combat, the men slipping away in small groups to give themselves up. Following the catastrophic failure of the Ardennes offensive, this trickle became a flood. Between January and April 1945, the Western Allies took over 1.5 million German prisoners. This was not a fighting force being defeated. It was an organization that was actively disintegrating. The Allies amplified this disintegration with a massive propaganda leaflet campaign. B-17 seconds and artillery shells delivered not bombs, but millions of safe conduct passes. These leaflets, printed in German, were masterpieces of psychological warfare. They were designed to look like official documents and promised any German soldier who presented one safe passage through Allied lines, fair treatment according to the Geneva Convention, and, most importantly, food and medical care. They were a direct personal invitation to abandon a lost cause, exploiting the very vulnerabilities that the prisoners' experience with American abundance had already confirmed. The psychological surrender was, therefore, the final and most decisive battle of the war in the West. It was a victory achieved not by a brilliant flanking maneuver or a heroic charge, but by the relentless, grinding power of the American factory and farm. The men who won this battle were not generals in polished boots, but quartermasters in muddy depots, logistics officers poring over shipping manifests, and factory workers in Detroit and Pittsburgh. They had created a system of such overwhelming material superiority that it made continued resistance seem not just futile, but insane. Faced with this irrefutable evidence, the individual German soldier did something extraordinary for a man raised in a totalitarian state. He made a personal, rational choice. He chose survival over a meaningless death. He chose the promise of a slice of white bread over the lie of a 1,000-year Reich. This quiet, individual decision, multiplied by 1,000,000, marked the true moment the war was lost. The initial shock of captivity eventually faded, replaced by the monotonous, soul-crushing routine of life behind barbed wire. As German prisoners were transported from the transit camps of France to more permanent facilities in the United Kingdom, or, for a lucky few, the United States, they entered a world of enforced idleness. This new reality, free from the immediate fear of death, provided something they had not had for years: time to think, to reflect, and to write. In crudely bound notebooks and on scraps of paper, they began to document their experiences and process the cognitive earthquake that had shattered their worldview. These diaries and letters, sent home through the Red Cross, were not meant for historians. They were personal, raw, and unfiltered. They are the primary evidence, the raw data, of a mass psychological surrender, chronicling in the prisoners' own hands the story of how American industry had conquered their minds. The theme that echoes through these documents with stunning consistency is an obsession with food. Historian Willy A. Bolker, in his compilation of German wartime documents, unearthed countless examples. A Gefreiter named Hans R., writing from a camp in England in January 1945, described his daily meals with the meticulous detail of a food critic. "Today for lunch, a stew," he wrote. "Not the water with a single potato eye staring up at you like at the front, but thick with real meat and carrots and peas. For breakfast, we had coffee. Not the black muckifuck from roasted acorns, but real bean coffee with milk and 2 spoonfuls of sugar. It is a miracle." This sense of wonder was almost always followed by a dawning sense of anger and betrayal. The same soldier wrote a week later, "They treat us correctly, according to the rules, but their correctness is its own form of cruelty. The guards smoke without care, eat chocolate bars in front of us. It is not done to taunt us, but because they have so much they do not even think of it. We were told they were weak, decadent, and on the brink of collapse. Who is truly on the brink of collapse? We have been lied to. We have been sacrificed for nothing." This sentiment was not confined to the enlisted ranks. In a stately home in England, known as Trent Park, British intelligence had secretly wired the rooms of captured high-ranking German officers. They hoped to gain tactical intelligence, but what they recorded was something far more profound: a post-mortem of the Third Reich, conducted by the very men who had led its armies. The transcripts are a stunning confirmation of the common soldier's experience, elevated to the level of grand strategy. Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, a general of panzer troops captured by the British in North Africa in 1942, was recorded telling a fellow general, "I saw the American factories on a tour before the war. I saw Ford. It is a production line of genius. I tried to explain it in my reports. I said that for every Tiger we can build, they will simply produce 50 of their Shermans. Quantity has a quality all its own." They did not want to hear it in Berlin. General Dietrich von Koltitz, the last commander of occupied Paris, was even more blunt in a conversation recorded in 1945. "The fundamental problem is this. Our entire war effort was a gamble based on a short war. It was a house of cards. When England did not fall and Russia did not collapse, we were doomed. We have no answer for the American Air Force, and less than no answer for their production. This war was decided by the factory worker in Detroit. The general's talk of production statistics and the private's obsession with white bread were two sides of the same coin. The industrial and statistical hammer that drove these conclusions was operating on a scale that almost defies belief. By the end of the war in Europe, in May 1945, the Western Allies held a staggering 7.6 million German prisoners of war. Managing this captive nation was one of the greatest logistical feats in history, and central to this management was feeding them. The Geneva Convention of 1929, to which the United States was a signatory, mandated that prisoners of war must be given a ration equivalent in quality and quantity to that of the detaining power's own base depot troops. For the U.S. Army, this meant a daily caloric intake for German POWs of between 2,500 and 3,000 calories. Now, consider the reality for a civilian in Germany at the same time. In Berlin, in the spring of 1945, the official ration for a normal consumer had fallen to less than 1,500 calories per day, and often the food available did not even meet that meagre target. The bitter, undeniable truth was that a German soldier was statistically better fed as a prisoner in an American camp than a German child was in his own capital city. The voices from the camps, therefore, provide the final, irrefutable evidence. They close the loop. The diaries, the letters, the secret recordings, they all tell the same story. The German soldier, from the lowest Gefreiter to the most decorated General Feldmarschall, ultimately reached the same conclusion. They had been sent to fight a war of blood and steel against an enemy who had mastered a new kind of warfare, a war of production, logistics, and overwhelming material abundance. They had not been outfought. They had been outproduced, out-organized, and ultimately outfed. Germany was not defeated by a failure of courage on the battlefield, but by a catastrophic failure of arithmetic in its factories and on its farms. Early 1945. The war, for the civilians of the Third Reich, was no longer a distant event heard on the radio. It was a physical, sensory assault. In cities like Berlin or Dresden, the air itself tasted of defeat, a gritty cocktail of pulverized brick dust, coal smoke, and the faint, sweet smell of decay. Life had shrunk to a series of primal, exhausting tasks. The terrifying scramble to an air raid shelter, the hours spent in line for a meagre potato ration, the constant gnawing calculus of survival. The world was grey skies, grey rubble, the grey faces of hungry people. The ultimate symbol of this existence was the Times Reichslebensmittelkarte asterisk, the food ration card, a flimsy piece of paper that held the power of life and death. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in a town like Dayton, Ohio, the war was a source of profound anxiety and patriotic fervor. But it was not a threat to survival. The air smelled of cut grass and industrial production. Life was structured around the rhythms of the factory shift, the school day, and the evening news. The war was present in the blue star banners hanging in windows, the scrap metal drives, the lines to buy war bonds. The American equivalent of the ration card, the war ration book, existed, but it represented a completely different concept. It was not a ticket to a near-starvation diet. It was a tool for managing a continental abundance, a minor inconvenience to ensure the boys overseas had everything they needed and more. This tale of two home fronts was the engine room of the entire conflict, and the German POW, tasting his first slice of white bread, was unknowingly tasting the final product of this vast, unbridgeable gap. The visceral reality of the German home front is captured with brutal honesty in the diaries of its survivors. The anonymous author of Times, A Woman in Berlin, Times provides a ground-level account of society's complete dissolution under the pressure of starvation. Her daily life, and that of her neighbours, revolved entirely around the procurement of food. The official rations were a joke, providing barely enough calories to sustain a bedridden invalid, let alone a person clearing rubble. This led to the rise of the black market, or Schleichhandel, where a wedding ring might buy a sack of potatoes, and a family heirloom could be traded for a slab of bacon. Hunger erased social norms. Doctors, lawyers, and professors learned the art of bartering and scrounging, their intellectual pursuits replaced by a desperate, animal cunning. The diary details the obsession with food, the endless conversations about it, the dreams of feasts that would never come. This was the psychological landscape of a nation being systematically starved, not just by Allied blockades and bombers, but by the utter failure of its own regime's economic and agricultural policies. On the American home front, the experience of rationing was an exercise in civic duty, not a struggle against famine. Publications from the era, like Times Life, Times Magazine, portrayed the war effort as a collective, can-do project. Rationing of items like sugar, coffee, meat, and gasoline was introduced not because of a dire shortage, but to control inflation and manage the logistics of supplying a global war. The government's Office of War Information launched massive campaigns with slogans like "Do with less, so they'll have enough." The most iconic symbol of this mindset was the Victory Garden. Millions of American families converted their backyards, and even public parks, into small vegetable plots. This was not done out of a desperate need to supplement a starvation diet. It was a patriotic act, a way for the average citizen to contribute tangibly to the war effort. The food produced was a supplement to an already plentiful food supply. The American home front was a place of shared purpose and minor sacrifices, a world away from the desperate individualistic struggle for survival unfolding in the ruins of Germany. The industrial hammer of statistics lays this contrast bare. By late 1944, the official ration card for a normal Verbraucher, normal consumer, in a German city like Hamburg, theoretically provided around 1,500 calories per day. By the spring of 1945, as the transportation network collapsed completely, the actual food available often delivered less than 1,200 calories. This is a diet of slow, inexorable starvation. Now, consider the American civilian. Despite rationing, the average daily caloric intake in the United States never fell below 3,000 calories per person throughout the entire war. The nation's agricultural sector, supercharged by mechanization and untouched by conflict, was so productive that the US was not only feeding its own population and a military of over 12 million, but was also shipping millions of tons of food to its allies, including Great Britain and the Soviet Union, under the Lend-Lease Act. This chasm between the two home fronts was the unspoken truth of the entire war. The German soldier had been told he was fighting for Time's Lebensraum *, for living space, to secure the resources to feed his people. The ultimate irony was that his defeat would bring him more and better food than his own nation could provide. The psychological shock experienced by the POW in the camp was not just a personal revelation. It was the sudden, crushing understanding that the very premise of his sacrifice was a lie. His family was starving back home, while the family of the guard watching over him was planting a victory garden out of a sense of patriotic surplus. The war had been decided not on the steppes of Russia or the beaches of Normandy, but in the wheat fields of Kansas and the grocery stores of Indiana. The Reich had demanded total sacrifice from its people and given them starvation in return. America had asked for moderate sacrifice and sustained an unprecedented level of abundance. This fundamental, unsustainable reality meant the end was not just likely, but inevitable. The anecdotes of the German prisoners, their shock at the softness of bread and the sweetness of Coca-Cola, are the human symptoms of a much larger, colder reality. They are the individual stories that prove a systemic truth. For years, the German soldier had been sustained by a belief in his own superiority, in the genius of his leaders, and in the indomitable spirit of his nation. But spirit cannot refine oil, and ideology cannot smelt steel. The war, from a purely logistical and industrial perspective, was a mathematical certainty long before the final shots were fired. The psychological surrender in the POW camps was simply the moment the average soldier was confronted with the final, brutal arithmetic of the production ledger. This is the story of that ledger, the industrial hammer of statistics that crushed the Third Reich far more completely than any single army. After the war, the Allies conducted the most comprehensive economic post-mortem in history, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. It was a clinical, data-driven analysis of how and why the German war economy had failed. Its conclusions were stark. The survey found that the single most decisive factor in the collapse of the German war machine was the destruction of its transportation network. Allied air power, by late 1944, had systematically obliterated the German railway system. Bridges were dropped, marshalling yards were turned into craters, and locomotives were strafed into ruin. This had a cascading effect that was utterly catastrophic. Coal from the Ruhr could not reach the steel mills. Steel from the mills could not reach the tank factories, and the finished tanks, even if they were produced, could not be moved to the front. The second critical blow was the campaign against Germany's synthetic oil production. Plants at places like Lohna were relentlessly pounded, cutting off the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe was grounded. Without fuel, the panzer divisions were reduced to static pillboxes. The result was that the frontline soldier was quite literally starved of everything: food, ammunition, reinforcements, and hope. The American quartermaster handing out bread in a transit camp was the endpoint of a logistical chain that worked. The German Lanza was the endpoint of one that was broken. This reality was not lost on the man in charge of the German economy, Armaments Minister Albert Speer. In his memoirs and post-war testimony, Speer detailed the frantic, and for a time, successful, efforts to increase German production. This was the so-called armament miracle of 1943 and 1944, where, despite the bombing, German factories produced more tanks and aircraft than ever before. But Speer himself admitted this miracle was a mirage. The production figures, while impressive in isolation, were meaningless when disconnected from the larger logistical reality. What was the use of building 1,000 new Messerschmitt fighters if there was only enough fuel to fly a fraction of them, and not enough training hours to produce competent pilots? What was the point of a new Tiger II tank, a marvel of engineering, if it had to be abandoned on the side of a road for lack of gasoline? Speer wrote of the constant, crippling shortages of essential raw materials, chromium, tungsten, molybdenum, that forced German industry to rely on inferior alloys. The result was that a late-war panzer, while looking formidable, often suffered from brittle steel armor and mechanical failures. Speer's miracle was the act of a man furiously redecorating a house whose foundations were crumbling into dust. The true scale of the disparity is only visible in a direct, side-by-side comparison of the industrial output for the pivotal year of 1944. These are the numbers that rendered the German war effort hopeless. In steel production, the fundamental building block of any war economy, the United States produced approximately 81 million tons. Germany and its occupied territories managed just 28 million. For every ton of German steel, America produced 3. In the vital category of military trucks, the legs of a modern army, the United States manufactured over 620,000 new vehicles. Germany produced around 88,000. many of which were of poor quality. This is why the American army was a fully motorized force, while the German army, even in 1944, still relied on over 1 million horses to pull its supplies. In aircraft, the US produced a staggering 96,000 planes of all types. Germany produced around 40,000. And most decisively, in crude oil, the lifeblood of 20th century warfare, the figures are almost beyond comparison. The Allies, led by the US, had access to well over 250 million tons of oil. Germany's supply, heavily reliant on fragile synthetic plants and the Romanian fields at Ploiesti, was collapsing to less than 10 million tons. These numbers are the final verdict. They are the source code of the German defeat. They explain, with mathematical precision, why the American GI had cigarettes and the German Lanza had sawdust bread. The war was not a contest of will, but a contest of production. And in that arena, the Third Reich was a regional power picking a fight with a global industrial colossus. The white bread in the POW camp was not a symbol. It was the edible printout of this data. It was the final, digestible result of a calculation that had been running in America's favor for years. This irrefutable numerical reality created a situation on the ground that would finally shatter the last remaining pillar of the German war effort, the propaganda narrative of Joseph Goebbels. For 12 years, the average German had lived within a hermetically sealed information environment, meticulously constructed and ruthlessly policed by Dr. Joseph Goebbels and his Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. It was a universe of alternative facts, a symphony of deceit played on a continuous loop through every newspaper, radio broadcast, and cinema screen. At the heart of this narrative were two fundamental and non-negotiable pillars. The first was the image of the German soldier, a racially pure, physically perfect, and spiritually indomitable Aryan Superman, whose victories were a testament to his innate superiority. The second was the portrayal of the enemy, particularly the American, a decadent, cowardly, and racially mongrelized gangster, whose society was a chaotic mess of jazz, music, crime, and Jewish-controlled finance, and whose army was an incompetent rabble on the verge of collapse. This was not just a story. For the German soldier, it was the official, state-sanctioned reality he carried in his mind into every battle. Yet, behind the curtain of this manufactured reality, the master propagandist himself was wrestling with the terrifying truth. The private diaries of Joseph Goebbels from the final year of the war are a chilling chronicle of a man whose public pronouncements were in direct opposition to his private knowledge. As the Western Allies crashed across France and the Red Army chewed up German divisions in the east, Goebbels' public rhetoric grew more hysterical and detached from reality. His speeches and editorials were no longer about confident victory, but about fanatical, desperate survival. He called for total war, a scorched earth policy where every man, woman and child would become a soldier in a suicidal last stand. He spoke of Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons that would snatch victory from the jaws of defeat at the last possible second. But his diary entries tell a different story. They are filled with despair over the catastrophic fuel shortages, fury at the incompetence of the Luftwaffe, and a growing, grudging respect for the sheer, brutal weight of Allied material power. The public facade was one of unshakable faith. The private reality was one of meticulously documented panic. He was trapped, forced to spin a narrative of impending victory to a nation he knew was already comprehensively beaten. For the German prisoner of war, the puncturing of this official reality was a sudden and brutal awakening. In the POW camps, the Allies began a systematic program of re-education, and its most potent tool was the simple movie projector. For the first time, German soldiers saw uncensored Allied newsreels. It was a moment of profound, vertigo-inducing shock. A soldier who had only seen the Deutsche Wochenschau newsreels, which portrayed the Normandy landings as a minor coastal incursion that was being heroically repulsed, was now confronted with the reality: an armada of thousands of ships, a sky black with aircraft, and an endless tide of men and machines pouring onto the beaches. They saw footage of American cities like New York, not as the dens of crime and poverty from their propaganda films, but as towering monuments of steel and glass, their streets choked with civilian automobiles. They were shown films of American factories, like the Ford plant at Willow Run, an industrial leviathan a mile long that was churning out a B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour. For these men, this was not just information, it was a revelation. The lie they had been told was not a small one. It was a lie of cosmic proportions, a complete and total inversion of the truth. Goebbels' propaganda ministry was, in itself, an industrial machine of immense scale. The Völkischer Beobachter, the official Nazi party newspaper, had a circulation in the millions. To ensure the state's message reached every home, the ministry subsidized the production of millions of cheap Volksempfänger radios, simple devices that were deliberately designed to have a weak reception of foreign broadcasts. The Deutsche Wochenschau, the weekly newsreel, was a high-quality, cinematically powerful production that was mandatory viewing in every cinema in the Reich. Goebbels had built an industrial-scale lie manufacturing apparatus, arguably one of the most effective in human history. Yet this entire colossal enterprise was rendered powerless by the simple, physical truth of American-made goods. The multi-million-dollar propaganda film claiming American industry was a sham was instantly refuted by the perfectly machined Zippo lighter in a guard's hand. The hours of radio broadcasts about the starving American populace were rendered absurd by the nutritional content of a single K ration. The industrial lie was no match for the industrial fact. Ultimately, Goebbels' symphony of deceit failed because it was a war of abstract words against an enemy who waged a war of tangible deeds. The Allied propaganda was not written on a leaflet. It was baked into a loaf of bread, bottled in a Coke, and rolled into a Chesterfield cigarette. Every single one of these items was a self-evident truth, a physical artifact that communicated a story of overwhelming material and logistical superiority. The German soldier, holding this evidence in his own hands, was forced to become his own fact-checker. He had to choose between the ephemeral, disembodied voice of the radio and the solid, undeniable reality he could taste, touch, and see. In this contest, there was no contest. The carefully constructed world of Nazi propaganda did not fall to a superior argument. It simply dissolved when exposed to the light of a far more powerful and persuasive truth. The final stage of the German POWs' education in American power was, for a select few 100,000, the most profound. A journey across the Atlantic into the heart of the arsenal of democracy itself. For these men, the experience was akin to being transported to another planet. After years spent in the bombed-out grey-brown ruins of Europe, America was a sensory explosion of color, space, and shocking normality. They were transported on trains that ran on time, through vast, undamaged landscapes of endless farmland and pristine forests. They passed through bustling towns and cities where the lights burned brightly at night, where shops were full of goods, and where the civilian population, while patriotic, seemed almost untouched by the privations of total war. This was the ultimate refutation of Goebbels' propaganda. The American home front was not on the brink of collapse. It was thriving with an energy and prosperity that was simply incomprehensible. Many of these prisoners were put to work, in accordance with the Geneva Convention, in non-military labor, often on American farms to alleviate manpower shortages. It was here that one of the core tenets of Nazi ideology was quietly and completely dismantled. The Blut und Boden, blood and soil, philosophy had glorified the German peasant as the racial and spiritual heart of the nation, a figure of strength and purity tied to the ancestral land. The POWs, many of whom came from rural backgrounds, were now confronted with the American farmer. In his memoir, Georg Gärtner, a German soldier who would later famously escape a US POW camp and remain at large for 40 years, described his astonishment. He saw a single American farmer, often a man in middle age, cultivating a vast expanse of land with a McCormick or John Deere tractor. This one man and his machine were doing the work that would have required an entire German village of men, women, and horses. He witnessed a level of casual mechanization and rural prosperity, automobiles, electricity, refrigerators in the farmhouses that made the romanticized Nazi ideal of the peasant seem primitive and pathetic. The American system was not just outproducing Germany in tanks, but in potatoes. Beyond the fields, the prisoners encountered an even more alien concept in the official re-education programs established in the camps. Historian Ron Robin termed these facilities the barbed wire college. For the first time in their adult lives, these German men were exposed to the principles of a free and democratic society. Camp libraries were stocked with the very books that had been burned by the Nazis a decade earlier. They were given access to uncensored American newspapers and magazines, allowed to read about the debates in Congress, the arguments between political parties, and the criticisms of President Roosevelt. Lecturers, often German-speaking Jewish intellectuals who had fled the Reich, gave talks on the structure of the U.S. Constitution, the principles of a free press, and the history of democratic thought. For men raised on the monolithic, unquestioning ideology of Führerprinzip, the leader principle, this exposure to a society that not only tolerated but encouraged dissent was a profound intellectual shock. They were learning that the source of America's strength was not just its factories, but its freedoms. The final, mind-bending piece of this new global puzzle was the revelation of America's true industrial reach, embodied in the Lend-Lease Act. As the prisoners began to understand the scale of American production, they were also confronted with a devastating strategic reality. America had not just been fighting them. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States had been simultaneously supplying their arch-nemesis, the Soviet Union. The numbers were astronomical. The German soldier who had been frozen and starved on the Eastern Front learned that the Red Army he had fought was being propelled forward by over 400,000 American-made Studebaker trucks and jeeps. He learned that Russian soldiers were being fed with millions of tons of American spam and flour, that Soviet factories were running on American raw materials. This was the ultimate checkmate. America was so powerful that it could simultaneously crush the Wehrmacht in the West while serving as the primary logistical engine for the Red Army in the East. It was not a nation fighting a war. It was a global economic system projecting power on a planetary scale. This forced immersion in the American system gave these German prisoners a unique and prescient glimpse into the new world that would emerge from the ashes of their own. They were among the first Europeans to truly understand the two colossal, victorious powers that would dominate the next half-century. They had seen the awesome productive power of American democratic capitalism firsthand, and they had been defeated on the Eastern Front by a Soviet war machine fueled by that same power. They left the camps not just as defeated soldiers, but as men with a new and terrifyingly clear understanding of the post-war geopolitical landscape. The seeds of the Cold War were visible to them in a way they could not be to those who had never left the rubble of Europe. They understood the new reality, because they had tasted it, they had read it, and they had seen it from a tractor on a farm in Minnesota. The war is over, but for a German prisoner named Klaus, now held in a camp in rural Alabama, it is only a distant memory. The daily routine is one of work, food, and waiting. One day, he receives a letter from his wife in Hamburg, the first in almost a year. The paper is thin, the handwriting shaky. He reads not of victory or defeat, but of survival. She describes a city of ghosts and rubble, of women, the Trümmerfrauen, clearing the bricks of their shattered homes by hand. She writes of the crushing, ever-present hunger, a hunger that makes his memories of the front line seem like a time of plenty. And then she writes of a miracle. A package has arrived from an American charity. In it, there was coffee, powdered milk, sugar, and a can of spam. She describes, with the same sense of wonder he himself had felt 2 years earlier, the taste of a piece of white bread baked from American flour. At this moment, Klaus's personal revelation becomes a shared national truth. The shock he experienced in the transit camp was not an anomaly. It was the prologue to the new reality for his entire people. He was simply the first to learn the lesson that all of Germany would now have to learn. Salvation and defeat had come from the same place. The man reading this letter was a ghost of the soldier who had shivered in the mud of the Hürtgen forest in 1944, a creature of hunger and indoctrination. That soldier had believed, with the last ounce of his strength, in the heroic narrative of the Reich. This prisoner, now well-fed and re-educated, understood the cold, hard prose of the production ledger. The bridge between these two men, the catalyst for this profound transformation, was the taste of a single slice of bread. This was the fulfillment of the war's unwritten thesis, that the Allied logistical machine, a force more powerful than any panzer division, had waged a silent and decisive war against the morale of the German soldier. It proved, beyond any doubt, that an army's spirit does not march on ideology alone, but on calories, and that the chasm between Germany's Ersatz reality and America's staggering abundance was wide enough to swallow the entire Third Reich. The journey from the foxhole to the barbed wire college was a journey from a lie to a truth, and the passport was a piece of food. This truth systematically dismantled every pillar upon which the Nazi war effort had been built. It defeated German logistics, not with a daring raid, but with the quiet, relentless delivery of Rations that made the Ersatz Kommissbrot a symbol of systemic failure. It defeated the German economy, not with a stock market crash, but with the casual abundance of Coca-Cola and cigarettes that exposed the hollow promise of the Nazi economic miracle. It defeated German propaganda, not with a clever counter-argument, but with the undeniable, physical evidence of a Zippo lighter and a Hershey bar, tangible facts that incinerated Goebbels' industrial-scale lies. And ultimately, it defeated the German soldier's will to fight, not by breaking his courage, but by presenting him with a logical, irrefutable case for the hopelessness of his own cause. The psychological surrender was a rational choice made by millions of individuals who had been shown, in the most direct way imaginable, that they had been sacrificed for a bankrupt ideal. The final, and perhaps most extraordinary, expression of this American industrial power was what came next. The same system that the POWs had witnessed as a tool of unimaginable destruction was now repurposed as a tool of unprecedented creation. This was the Marshall Plan. In the years following the war, the United States poured more than $13 billion, the equivalent of over $173 billion today, into rebuilding the shattered economies of Europe, including that of its former enemy, West Germany. The industrial hammer was now used to forge plowshares. The same Liberty ships that had carried tanks and ammunition to Europe now returned carrying tons of grain, food, and construction materials. It was the ultimate demonstration of the system's power. It could not only outproduce its enemies in a war, but it could also afford to rebuild them in the peace that followed. This was a philosophy of power so alien to the Nazi worldview of brutal, zero-sum conquest that it represented the final, conclusive victory of ideas. In the final analysis, the Second World War in Europe was a conflict decided long before the final battles. It was not won by the brilliance of generals or the fanaticism of ideologies, but by the simple, brutal, and undeniable arithmetic of the factory and the farm. It was a war of production, and in that contest, Germany was never a true contender. The entire, complex story of this industrial slaughter, of strategic bombing, of logistical chains, of economic collapse and psychological warfare, can be found and understood in the story of a single German soldier, a man who was pushed to the edge of starvation for a lie, and then, in defeat, was handed a truth he could hold in his hand. A simple, mass-produced, perfectly white slice of bread,